Hey garden friends, Landon Gilfillan here with Pepper and Pine Garden Design on another beautiful April day, late April actually, moving into May. I can't believe it. We've had some doozy of cold weather here the past couple days, but it's really starting to warm up, so that's exciting. So today I've been out planting out some of my late cool season things like chard, kale, leeks, calendula, and something else I can't remember. Anyway, I wanted to do a video talking about some of the things that I've learned and will probably do differently next year for my seed starting and early spring garden sowing. And what made me think about this was as I've been looking at these plants and preparing to bring them outdoors, noticing which ones have done really well and which ones haven't. In the house and out of the house. So I thought I would pass on my experience to you because I did try some different things this year and some of them worked and some of them didn't. So let's get into that. Right now, I have this lovely bunch of multi-sown leeks. In the past, I have always done onions, either purchase them as sets where they already have the small bowl, but they're dried and you just pop them down into the ground. And I've had a lot of success starting onions from sets, but those can actually be fairly expensive if you're wanting to grow as many as we need here on our homestead with a family of 7. So I've been looking for some more inexpensive ways to grow onions. And one way to do that is to obviously start them from seed. But anytime I've ever started onions from seed, they haven't done really well. And that's because I've tried to sow them as single seeds, maybe 1 or 2 per cell. And they've just always been really spindly, or if I planted them out in the garden, they just haven't done very well. Or the most that they'll do is become a spring or a green onion instead of actually bulbing like my onion sets always have. So I've been reading more about starting onions in a bunch like this, where you actually have a larger cell and you sprinkle the onion seed on top and let them grow like this. So these are leeks that I've done here, and it's time to put them in the ground. And here's what I've decided. I'm not a huge fan of this method either, but I think this is definitely better than trying to, grow 1 and 2 seeds per cell. So let me show you here what they look like and what I've decided is going to be the best way to do leeks or onions in general. So as you can see all the individual leeks there. And what I'm doing is I'm literally pulling out like probably 3 or 4 leeks at a time. Now I do not want to plant these in the ground as single leek plants. They just won't hold up very well. But what they will do is grow really well in a clump like this of 3, maybe 4 at top leeks. So I'm trying to pull them out like 3 or 4 at a time, which is not easy to pull them out just a few at a time. They're really wanting to come out in clumps of like 5 or 6, but I really only went 3 or 4 and I don't want to waste them either. So here's the solution that I have come to. I've been doing a lot of reading lately about multi-sowing plants like radishes, beets, turnips, onions, and leeks. And what you do is instead of multi-sowing them in a huge bunch like this, you actually multi-sow them in groups of like 5 or 6 per cell, and then maybe depending on how they germinate, you thin down to 4 plants. That's for a leek. 3 or 4 plants probably maximum. And then in that little cell that you've grown inside with 3 or 4 leeks in a clump, you just come right out and plunk your little plug into the ground. Instead of trying to separate them like this, loosening their roots from the soil that they've grown in and trying to stabilize them in the dirt. By growing them together in a clump, in a smaller clump than this, when you're not having to separate them, they actually do so much better. They have stabilization, their roots aren't being tampered with too much, and they can go right in the ground where you want them. Now I'll show you in a second. What I'm doing here doesn't look too bad, but I'm seeing that it would just be so much more efficient and probably more successful to do it in that fashion where I have a cell tray, 3 or 4 seeds per cell, and then I just plunk the whole little thing right into the ground. So let me show you what I'm doing here. This is kind of dry. I actually did water these, but they've already dried out since I've watered them. I'm just pulling the edges of them off here and trying to pull as few at a time as possible without disrupting the roots too much. So just right there, I probably have 8 to 10 leeks. Well, that's too many for a clump. So now I'm having to separate them further, and you can see what's happening to their roots. So if I'm gonna set these in the ground like that, it's just really not the ideal way to set plants like this into the ground. The ground here is fairly loose, which is good, but it's just not going to give them enough structure as a small baby plant like this. So I'm digging a little hole and I'm sticking them in there, and I'm trying to push the dirt really well around their roots to stabilize them. And then I'll mulch them here in a second. But in the future, I am definitely not going to do it this way. I'm going to grow them in cells of 4 or 5 leeks at a time. You can do this multi-sowing practice also with just regular onions, whether they're bulb onions or bunching onions. If you're going to do bulb onions, you maybe want to sow 5 or 6 seeds per cell, but then you want to thin down to 3 or 4 tops bulb onions per clump. They just do better, and they're not competing for nutrients when you have 3 or 4, and they still will bulb really nicely. If you're going to do spring onions or salad onions, you can plant those more per clump. So you can probably sow like 8 to 10 seeds per cell, but then thin down to 6 or 7, and they'll grow really well because you're not waiting for that big bulb. You're just getting that nice slim spring onion that you can throw in a salad or on top of a dish. And there are so many other things that you can multi-sow, and I actually wrote a blog about it, which you can find in the description, 5 groups of plants to multi-sow. So if you want to know more about plants that you can multi-sow in a cell, like radishes, beets, turnips, and so much more, go to my blog article down there. I tell you how many seeds to put per cell, per plant, and then what to thin down to grow in a plant in your clump in your garden. But I will definitely be doing more multi-sowing in the future, and I already have some going in my house that I will put out here later in the season. The other thing that I'll be doing differently is I really think I'm going to be moving away from seed starting mix with my seeds and moving more towards compost and really nice potting soil. Potting soil would probably be my second choice. I'm in the midst of really getting my compost system going here so that I have ready compost for throughout the year, but also when I'm starting seeds. I really believe that's the best way to start a seed. Potting soil is okay. Some of them tend to be more coarse, and I'm looking for right between too fine and something that's too coarse that doesn't give your seedling roots enough structure. So one of the things that I tried this year that I initially really liked was the cocoa coir bricks, which have been really kind of like all the rage lately. And I have a video on my Instagram that shows the process in a time lapse of putting the cocoa coir brick into water and how it expands in 25-35 minutes and really makes a really nice textured medium for starting seedlings. I really actually like the way it feels. I like the density. It's not too dense, not too coarse. It was great for starting seeds. However, you really cannot leave your seedlings in cocoa coir for longer than 2 or 3 weeks before they really start taking a hit nutritionally. The plants that I started in my potting soil versus the cocoa coir, the potting soil plants did way better. They are huge, they look super healthy, and the ones that I started in the cocoa coir that I haven't gotten transplanted in time, and even have gotten transplanted into something else, and have just looked really puny. Their leaves have turned yellow or purple due to a lack of nitrogen. And even if you're starting something in a seed starting mix or something like this, cocoa coir, you're gonna have to transplant them into something that gives them more nutrition, generally around week 3. Or give them some sort of food, which I have done. I actually have given those plants that are in that cocoa coir mix food, but they still have not recovered as well as the plants that I started in the potting soil. So this is great. It was definitely cheaper than buying seed starting mix, even in the big bags. So if I'm going to do seed starter, I definitely would go the cocoa coir route. I really like the texture, but again, you have to be ready to transplant those plants into the ground or into a larger cell with more nutrition at around 3 weeks, because this is just not going to do it for them. So a good for money, but definitely not good for growing plants past 3 weeks. So I'm kind of hit or miss on this. I really think I'm just going to move away from seed starter when it comes to propagating seeds inside. Some things that I've learned from this process are things I did right that I have done different than past years, but feel like really worked for me, is starting some things way earlier than like what's recommended on the seed calendar. So I started my herbs and my peppers in late January, early February, and that was great. My herbs look awesome. They're like the size that you would get from a store. A really good size, and herbs take a while to get going. Planting them from seed is really sort of tedious. It takes a while. So I'm really glad that I started those as early as I did, and my goal was by Valentine's Day, and I'm really glad I did that. Same with my peppers. My peppers are looking great. They're going to be a great size to put in the garden here in the next couple of weeks. So I'm really glad I started my peppers in late January, early February. Some things I probably will not be starting that soon again. My original thought was I wanted them to be a good size to put in the early spring garden, but I'm not convinced I want them to be in the early spring garden, and that is kale and chard. Chard, I've read in some places, is cold hardy and can handle those cold frosts. I think if established early enough, and same with kale. Kale is supposed to do really well when it's affected or coming in contact with the frost. It's actually supposed to sweeten its flavor. And I actually do believe that to be the case, but I think that is more in regards to kale grown in the fall going into the winter. So an already established kale plant is going to do fine once those frosts start coming, and maybe even chard as well. I don't think that is so much the case in the spring. In fact, I'm learning more and more. I'm planting celery while I'm talking to you. So while I'm looking down, I'm talking to you. In Southwest Michigan, I'm learning more and more that some of these plants, if they're started too early and they're used to that cold weather, and then all of a sudden the hot spring weather or really warm spring, almost summer weather hits, it causes them to bolt really early. And those are things like beets and chard and even kale. So I am thinking that I am going to continue to do kale when I normally do, maybe starting it now, like mid-April, early April, something like that, giving him a good head start inside and then putting him outdoors. And really, in my climate, you could really start kale in late April and early May, and it would still have, it loves the warmer weather. It would still do fine throughout the summer, especially here in Michigan, and then wouldn't have that chance of bolting once the weather warms up. So all of that to say that I think I'm going to wait on my chard and kale and continue to do what I've done in the past, which is sowing that in mid-April, maybe early April into May. Other things that I'm going to do differently that, well, actually I did some of my plants this way and some of them I didn't, and I absolutely found it to be a much better process to plant my seeds inside and immediately put those seeds on a heat mat until they've germinated. Number one, seeds, whether they're cold season seeds or warm season seeds, germinate best in warmth. There's very few that don't require that warmth to germinate. Once they've germinated, you can actually take them off that heat mat and they don't necessarily need that heat to grow. That's why outdoor greenhouses do really well. If you can provide them a hotbed or a warm place to germinate and then put them out in those unheated greenhouses, they'll continue to grow just fine, unless the temperatures are below the temperature that those plants like. So if inside your greenhouse or your house is below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, then plants like peppers and eggplants and sometimes tomatoes will not do very well. But most people's homes are much warmer than 50 degrees Fahrenheit, so you could germinate them on that seed mat and then move them off and have space to germinate some more plants on that seed mat. So moving forward, I'll be using my seed mats, heat mats, using my heat mats for germination and not so much keeping my plants warm. I have noticed over the years that keeping my plants on a heat mat, and I generally only keep hot loving or warm loving plants on a heat mat, they dry out really quickly. But when I germinate plants on those heat mats, they germinate way faster and they seem to do a lot better. So I will definitely be reserving my heat mats for germination only. The other thing that I'm going to do, I generally have all my peppers together, all my tomatoes together. Sometimes I have trays sharing 2 different types of plants. So moving forward, I'm going to be really specific in doing is only sharing trays with plants that I will harden off together. So if I have plants that I'm putting outside where the temperatures are above 40 degrees, I want to make sure that tray doesn't have a mixture of plants that prefer 40-degree weather and plants that prefer 50-degree weather. Now that generally hasn't been the case for me, but there have been some instances where I've had a tray mixed with pots that prefer different hardening off temperatures. So I'm going to make sure that I organize my seedlings in ways that I can easily move them off the shelf and outside. And that also means where I'm organizing them on my seed racks or on my grow shelves. There we go. On my grow shelves. So I know exactly which shelves can go out in wet weather and come right back. And I'm not searching through my grow racks looking for certain plants. And for the most part, I've done that this year. I'm just seeing more and more how that can really help with efficiency and just staying organized. Because hardening off is never really a fun process, but the more organized you are and the more efficient you are in your organization, it makes that process a lot easier. Last but certainly not least, I think the thing that I am absolutely going to do moving forward that I'm starting right now is more succession sowing. One of my past videos that you can find here, I talk about some of the unorthodox seed starting methods that I'm trying. And I say unorthodox just because they're not generally what's recommended or generally what's talked about, I feel like. But I am finding that these practices are making me have a lot more success with my plants. And that's starting plants inside that aren't generally recommended to start inside, like cucurbits, squash and melons and pumpkins and things like that, even beans and peas, which are generally recommended to sow directly outside. I'm finding to have some success doing those inside, as well as things like beets and radishes and turnips, multi-sowing those in cells that will go directly into the ground. Same with lettuces and spinaches and chards and kales, growing those in those cells and being able to pop them directly in the ground right where I want them. I'm finding a lot more success than just random sowing. And when I say random sowing, I just mean those itty bitty tiny seeds, trying to get them right where you want them out in the ground means more thinning for you in the future. However, if I can prick them out of a seed tray into a little cell and plant it so that cell is ready to go out before I have to transplant it to a larger cell, then that makes planting out much simpler. So succession sowing is just continuing to sow throughout the year, not looking at May 15th as the last day I'll have plants in my house. I'm actually have a calendar that I'll be sharing on my blog here in the next month or so that shows you how you can be planting really every month of the year, with the exception of maybe December and January, when there's really nothing that can be going out in the ground. But really starting in February, you can start sowing and propagating seeds in your house and succession planting them outside. So you start them, and then around 3 or 4 weeks, you plant them out, with the exception of those bigger plants I've already mentioned, like eggplant, peppers, and herbs. So succession sowing and sowing more things inside and starting less things in the ground, that is what I'll be changing moving forward. So for the most part, the only thing I'll be sowing directly into the ground are parsnips and carrots, which just do not do well sown in a cell and transplanted out. And that's because their taproot is what we're eating. So if you disturb that taproot anyway, it's either going to be misshapen or it's just not going to grow, and then you don't have that particular food. Things like beets and radishes and turnips and rutabaga and celeriac, those things, even though you are eating the root, they don't seem to be as affected whenever they're moved from a cell into the ground. So while I still may plant some things in the ground here and there, like spinach and arugula, I'm going to try to put my focus and my energy towards growing most things in my house and then moving them out and putting them exactly where I want in the ground. I really just think that's going to help with garden organization, efficiency, and the overall success of my plants. And that also goes to my flowers as well. I generally don't spend as much time on my flowers inside because I have so much focus going to my vegetables, but I have a bunch of flowers started inside that I'm going to be especially succession planting sunflowers so they continue to bloom throughout the summer. Those are my goals for this season and definitely moving forward. So I hope that's been helpful in just kind of thinking through successes I've had, not necessarily failures I've had, maybe it's things that didn't work as well. I mean, every year gives you an opportunity to learn something from what you've done, something that's worked better, something that hasn't worked as well, and how you can change your processes moving forward. So these are things that I am finding that give me more success, that are helping my system to be more efficient, and yours may be completely different. It may be just a lot easier and more efficient for you to plant things in the ground or whatever your specific situation may be. So as always, I'm here to encourage you to try new things, to experiment, to not be dismayed by failure, but to look at that as an opportunity to grow and become a better gardener. So thank you for watching, and make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and share these videos to anyone they might be helpful for. I love hearing your comments, and if you have any questions or things you'd like to see, be sure and put those in the comments below. And as always, I'm Landon Gilfillan with Pepper and Pine Garden Design, growing gardeners and their gardens. We'll see you in the next video.